I think we have 4 o'clock, and I'm going to go ahead and kick off our inaugural Humanities at Home live program. So I think some people will continue to be joining us as we go through this, and that's great. Just want to kind of say hello to everybody out there, all the humanities lovers all across Nebraska and possibly beyond, who are taking some time out of your day to listen in and learn a little bit about Willa Cather and kind of reconnect. Just to kind of briefly mention, Humanities Nebraska, we're a statewide nonprofit organization and doing all kinds of work in the humanities, and all of that involves bringing people together and exploring the humanities together. And, obviously that's been really hard to do in recent weeks. So we've seen a lot of our normal programming disrupted, and we miss everybody. We miss all the people that we're usually working with all over the state. And so we just thought one way we could rectify that is trying to connect as much as we can in other ways, including the humanities at home and doing some virtual programming. So I'm Chris Sumrick, by the way, Executive Director of Humanities Nebraska, and I'll introduce our special guest today, Andy Jewell, in a moment. I also want to mention Erica Hamilton is our Director of Literary Programs for Humanities Nebraska, and you'll understand why she's with us here as well as we get to some question and answers later. She's our own Willa Cather Scholar on the Humanities Nebraska staff. And we do, like I said, we do a lot of different work all over the state. We're funded in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities, by the Nebraska Cultural Endowment. We have a little bit of state funding from the state of Nebraska that really helps out. And one of our most important sources of funding is our individual and organizational donors across Nebraska. And we're very grateful for the people all throughout the state who support us. And especially now, we know there's a lot of great needs out there around the state. And so just thank you all for what you do for the humanities and for so many other good causes and needs out there in the state. So the genesis of Humanities at Home's Willa Cather version with Andy Jewell today actually kind of goes back to the beginning of March. I was in Washington, and it was just when everybody was getting really concerned, obviously, about the ongoing situation here. But I had a moment, an opportunity to go into Statuary Hall and check out the new Chief Standing Bearer statue representing Nebraska in Statuary Hall, which is just magnificent. And of course, and Joe Starita, if you happen to be watching, you're on my list to talk to about this, my friend, because it would be great to have you do a program about Chief Standing Bearer. But it led to a conversation about the anticipation of feeling for Willa Cather coming to Statuary Hall to represent Nebraska sometime in the next year or so. There's a wonderful sculptor in Omaha named Littleton Alston right now who's working on that sculpture. You can check out a great 30-minute documentary on NET television about that as well. And it just led to some conversations about the importance of Willa Cather to Nebraska and so forth. So then coming out of that, realizing that we wanted to do some virtual programming and maybe highlight some of the speakers we work with, the wonderful scholars that give programs all over the state who aren't able to do so right now because of the current situation with the pandemic. We thought, well, who could we go to first to help us try this out? And leapt to mind was Dr. Andy Jewell for many reasons. He's a wonderful scholar. He's a fantastic person overall. He happens to be a longtime friend of mine. So if anybody would go down in flames with me on this, it would be Andy. And he also is in our Speakers Bureau, and he gives programs. I enjoyed one program with him. We drove out to Gordon, Nebraska together and did a program at the Gordon Public Library. So Andy's really committed to both the public humanities and great scholarship at UNL. And so just really briefly to kind of introduce Andy in terms of his scholarship, he is the professor of digital projects at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in the libraries there. And he's also the editor of the Willa Cather Archive. And if you've ever seen, I don't know if this is backwards to you or not on your screen, but it's the selected letters of Willa Cather. Andy is a co-editor of that, and which is also morphed into a broader online project, funded in part by National Endowment for Humanities. And he's just got lots of wonderful things going on related to Willa Cather and otherwise. So I myself am just a Cather enthusiast, so I can claim a lot of ignorance and just ask Andy lots of dumb questions of myself. And then I know some really intelligent questions will come in from people on Facebook Live. So again, at the end, Erica will be asking questions on behalf of the people posting on Facebook. And Andy and I talked about, we thought it would be neat if you post a question, will you share where you are from? Since this is Humanities at Home, maybe just identify where home is to you. So home for me is I'm in my home in Lincoln, Nebraska, and I'm just really glad that you're joining us today. So Andy, I'd like to turn it over to you, and just maybe we could start with maybe you just giving kind of a snapshot a little bit of why Willa Cather is such an important literary figure in Nebraska.
Sure, you know it, and I am also at home here in Lincoln, Nebraska, and thank you very much, Chris, and to Humanities Nebraska to be part of this. As I told Chris, I would do anything he asked me to do. He's a great organization. Willa Cather, I think a lot of us in Nebraska, a lot of people in Nebraska think of her as someone we talk about because she's a local girl. You know, but I like to always point out that she is well known around the world. She's been translated into 40 different languages, won virtually every literary prize available during her lifetime. The Pulitzer Prize is one of the most well known. The only one she didn't win was the Nobel Prize for Literature, but when the first American, Sinclair Lewis, won it, he'd like to say, thank you, but you probably should have given it to Willa Cather, which she thought was very nice of him. So she's a wonderful writer with a big readership around the world, and we're lucky to have her in Nebraska as part of our history, because she came here when she was just 9 years old. Her family is from Virginia, and she came to Webster County and then to Red Cloud, Nebraska. Went to high school, grew up in Red Cloud, where today is the National Willa Cather Center, a wonderful place with historic properties and museum and exhibits and archive that I encourage everyone to visit. They're doing a lot of things virtually right now, and I would encourage you to check that out. And then in 1890, she came to Lincoln to the University of Nebraska, where she was a student, and she graduated in 95. And though she moved away from Nebraska after that and lived in Pittsburgh and then New York, she came back here regularly throughout her life for many, many decades, and would spend weeks or months here at a time. So it was always important to her. And of course, the reason we know her so well is because of the many books she wrote about Nebraska, the novels like Oh Pioneers and My Antonia and The Lost Lady, and so many others which feature characters and settings of the state.
That's great. Could you describe a little bit, Andy, what it was like to work on those selected letters of Willa Cather, and just the you know, it struck me in the letters I read just what incredible works of art every letter was to just one individual. And I can't imagine what kind of an undertaking that was for you to go through all that. You want to share about that?
Yes, when I first started in graduate school learning kind of deeply about Willa Cather, her letters were virtually inaccessible. She did not allow her correspondence to be published after her death and in her will, and it took many years until her executor, the Willa Cather Trust, decided to allow them to be published. And just around 9 years ago is when they made that decision. We published the book in 2013. But because of that part of her, those letters were inaccessible, I think I, like so many people, had a version of her that was a little bit askew from who I think she really was. A version of her is kind of removed, sort of humorless, sort of the kind of person who gave her life to her art. And then when you read her letters, which I began to be able to do first as a student and then as a faculty member, and then intensely for the last several years, you realize what a funny, affectionate, interesting, complex person she was. She's very witty. Her letters are the work of a wonderful writer, you know, and but she is applying them in a kind of a more an informal tone, often than she'll use in her published work. Sometimes more revealing, sometimes more crabby, sometimes jokey in a way that she wasn't always in her published work. And they've been wonderful. And they're spread out around the world. About 100 different repositories around the world have Cather letters. The University of Nebraska-Lincoln and the National Willa Cather Center in Red Cloud have some of the biggest collections, but there are many collections all over. And right now, and the book gathers many of them, but it's sort of a greatest hits sort of thing. It's only about 18% of the total known letters. And we followed up that book with a multi-year team project called The Complete Letters of Willa Cather, which the National Endowment for the Humanities is supporting. And a big team of us, of students and scholars, faculty members are working together to edit these letters and put them online. Right now that we have about 1,600 free for everybody to read online with full annotations and images of the original documents. And within the next couple of years, we'll finish the other half.
Fantastic. And how does one easily find those online? Where would you direct people?
It's on the Willa Cather Archive. The URL is cather.unl.edu. And right there, you'll see a big link on that splash page to the Complete Letters of Willa Cather. If you also search the Complete Letters of Willa Cather, you can find it that way.
Terrific. Thank you. Okay, you know, I'm going to turn it over to Erica here for a minute, because I wanted to see if we have any questions coming through on Facebook yet that you want to share, Erica. And again, Erica Hamilton is our Director of Literary Programs. Thank you.
Right. We do have a question. This one comes from Ellen Lyric. She is from Alliance. And her question is, what inspired Cather to write Death Comes for the Archbishop? Ellen was just in Santa Fe, and she loved her description of the land in that area. And I would like to add to Ellen's comment that I read Death Comes for the Archbishop during a visit to Santa Fe.
Oh,
and being there in that country just really brings that book to life, I think. So what did inspire Cather to write that book?
Well, part of it was her own travels to the Southwest. She started going there first in about 1912 and went back many times. Those travels in that landscape were influential to her, and she found a couple different ways to write about it. It does appear in some earlier works. And that one was, she said, inspired by a book she found, which were letters, a book of letters, from one of the priests who inspired characters in that novel. And she felt when she got that, she got the concept for how she wanted to approach a historical novel about that landscape. And she thought to focus it through the French priests who were immigrants into that land and who were trying to translate their own cultural ways into a new place would be of real interest to her and to readers. And she created a book that is widely regarded as one of the great books in American literary history. Yeah, I recommend Death Comes to the Archbishop as a very different kind of Cather book for those who only know her Nebraska books. It's a wonderful novel.
I agree. I just really enjoyed that book. I've told you before, Andy, that when I was a kid, I read a lot of Westerns, and just that feel of the Southwest that I feel, I really just enjoyed that book as well.
The book, I know a lot of people, because it has to do with very spiritual characters and it's rich in the spiritual life, people will talk about it in very deep terms, and it carries that weight. But then Cather also said to her family, okay, that's all good, but also sometimes read it like you'd read Swiss Family Robinson and just enjoy the adventure of it. So both are working there on the same time.
That's great. I want to ask you a little bit about Red Cloud, and that is, I went to Red Cloud, my wife and I, just actually back again in very beginning of March. We stopped through Red Cloud and stayed the night and just went out to the Cather Prairie and everything. I know you serve on the Willa Cather Foundation board, and obviously Red Cloud is very connected to Cather. Can you talk a little bit about that connection between Red Cloud and Cather and how she's written about it and so forth?
Yes, it is. The town of Red Cloud, in real detailed ways, its people, its geography, have influenced many different Cather works. You can read passages of My Antonia and then walk in the modern versions of those same streets. You can read about the Harlings in My Antonia and then go to Red Cloud and visit the Minor House, which is the Harling house was based on. You can go to Cather's childhood home and then kind of enter into the experience of her great short story called Old Mrs. Harris, which is set into that home. It's a really remarkable thing. It's the largest collection of historical properties dedicated to an American author in the world. And it's been wonderfully maintained over many decades by the Willa Cather Foundation, and now the National Willa Cather Center is there with wonderful exhibits. And so I really, it's a moving experience to go there if you're a Cather reader. And if you're just being introduced to Cather, it's a wonderful way to get to know about her in a way that's very interactive and very fun.
Yeah, and I'd say hats off to the Cather Foundation for the work they've done and teaming up with Red Cloud on economic development, and just it's a really wonderful town to visit. Great pizza place in that town, by the way. Okay, Erica, how about another question from people listening in on Facebook Live?
Well, now I want to go to Red Cloud for pizza because it is really, really good.
It is.
And they have some amazing recipes too. This question is from Michael Burton. He says, I'm glad you mentioned her humor. I have found humor in some of her published work. What are some of your favorite humorous moments in her work?
Okay, Michael, I'm so glad you're there. Everyone should know that Michael has a great exhibit that was at the recently came about Cather's work. He's an artist and a filmmaker, and so thank you, Michael. What are the, so I can't recall for jokes off the top of my head word for word, but I know that in her journalism, one thing I love about that work is she could be hilariously cutting. When she didn't like someone, she would let you know it and make fun. There's one long passage where she just talks about a guy's chin and chest for a long time, you know, just making fun of him, or said, this woman this actress is a wonderful beauty when she has her veil on. You know, there's lots of little comments like that. But then throughout her letters, over and over again, there are jokes and asides. Sometimes it's just the tone that is so funny that she will be kind of critical, but then get into this sarcastic, witty tone to hold forth about her options. One I ran across the other day for the first time that made me laugh, which someone wrote her about a sonnet that she had written as a young poet and wanted to include it in a book of his, I believe. And she said, well, and he wrote her as a professor, and she said, well, that sonnet is not very good, and you should know that if you're a professor. You know, and she kind of is joking and a little sly as she's doing that. But I just really enjoy the tone she has and her willingness to just speak her mind plainly.
That's great. And yeah, the letters and those selected letters of Willa Cather, there's just humorous comments throughout those. That cutting sense of humor is definitely evident and all over the place. Yeah. I wanted to ask, getting back to you had the question earlier about Death Comes for the Archbishop. You know, most people are familiar with Willa Cather from reading My Antonia or O Pioneers, and which are fantastic. But I'm just wondering, what else would you suggest for people, especially if they're catching up on their reading list right now? What other kind of suggestions would you have to explore other aspects of Cather?
Well, I might suggest two titles that are from relatively early in her career and relatively late, and they go together nicely. The first one is The Song of the Lark, which is about a young woman growing up in a Western small town that's based on Red Cloud, who becomes a world-renowned opera star. And it's really a wonderful novel, atypical for Cather in its story of a young woman growing up. She doesn't usually use those kind of plot lines exactly like that, but it's a woman kind of becoming an artist. And it's a triumphant story, full of complexity and depth, but a triumphant story. And then many years later, she wrote another book called Lucy Gay Heart that has some of that basic premise. A young woman from a small Western town goes to study music in Chicago, but there's a very different outcome to the second time Cather went to that starting point. And the story of Lucy Gay Heart is a much more bittersweet story. I taught a Cather class last semester at the university, and many of my students picked Lucy Gay Heart as their favorite. It's a beautiful, beautiful book, and not that well known among many Cather readers. So I'd recommend those two, The Song of the Lark and Lucy Gay Heart.
Excellent, thank you. Erica, I believe you have another question for us from our listeners.
Yeah, we have one from Barry, and I'm probably going to mispronounce his last name. I think it's Hudak.
Oh, Barry. Hey, Barry.
Did I get that right, Andy?
Yeah. Barry, don't
good.
make this too hard, please.
He's,
Barry is another Cather scholar who I know from Cather conferences.
Okay. Well, then I'm going to see him and he's going to tell me whether or not I get his last name right. He's from Urbana, Illinois. He says, are there any intriguing letters added to the collection recently?
You know, I feel like almost every day we are working together, you know, a large group of us, and discovering things, finding things. And adding those letters, they'll all be there. I will share one thing from this week. What was it, late last week? Anyway, Melissa Homestead, a fellow editor of the letters, and I were remote working and talking over Slack channel about a mysterious letter that we were trying to figure out the date for. It was Cather talking about she wished she would have written one book, it would have been War and Peace. And it was pretty funny. She said, I guess I'm not going to be shy. I'm going to say, I wish I would have wrote War and Peace. What a great book. We've had the sense that it seemed to be written in a little bit different style. And I said, I think this one was written for publication. And thanks to the magic of the internet, within an hour or so, we figured out it was something we did not know before that Cather had published in the Chicago newspaper in 1922 from a series that her friend Fanny Butcher did about authors discovering which book they wish they would have written. And so it was just a little bit of a detail that the research on the letters pulls up all the time, but there's so many that we find. And I have to say too, that the more you look, the more you find. We tend to, we'll contact a repository and say, we have a list of 12 or 15 letters that we believe are there. And they'll say, yes, thank you. Here are all of our Cather letters. And we found a few more you didn't know about. And we learn all the time. And so we're so glad that the National Endowment for the Humanities and the university, in support of the Cather Foundation, to make all of these freely available and searchable to everyone. And I say a big shout out to the Center for Digital Research in the Humanities at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. It's really the support of that team and that infrastructure we have that we can do this. It's a really great resource at the university.
That's a great point. That really is a great team there. And I'm always struck by the partnerships happening around the country and through the university here and other institutes of higher education. And really, you know, for us, we're about the public humanities and bringing people like you to the public, but it's really neat to watch all the scholarship going on and the partnerships that are part of that. Erica, do you have another question right now for Andy? If not, I will ask one. I'll ask one while Erica's
I do.
Okay, you go right ahead then.
In fact, we got 3 in, but I can only see one of them right now. So I'm trying to find the other 2 that disappeared. But this one is from Patty Bohart. She's from Lincoln. And she says, one of my favorite Cather books is The Professor's House. Oh, yeah. Is there any background you could share that went into writing this book? And I promise I'm going to try to find the other 2 questions.
There's a kind of interesting story about The Professor's House. For those who've read it, you may remember it's split into 3 distinct parts. The first and third part are about the professor, Godfrey St. Peter, and his family. And the center part is the story of Tom Outland in the Southwest. And it is a very different tone and feel than the rest. Well, one thing interesting about the background of that book is Cather had written that middle part called Tom Outland's story earlier on in her career. We think she had something called the Blue Mesa that she was working on when she was in about 1916, when she came back to Nebraska and she was traveling, and that was the novel she's working on, the Blue Mesa. But then she ran into Annie Pavelka when she was back visiting and got inspired for the novel that became My Antonia. So she put the Blue Mesa aside and wrote My Antonia. And then, you know, a few years later, when she's working on The Professor's House, she had the insight to combine this new idea with this old manuscript and create this amazing work called The Professor's House. And so the history there is based on some of her travels to the Southwest. But the professor and his family is distinct in Cather's fiction is that there are no, you know, real confidently known prototypes or historical people, that they seem to be just Cather's sort of creations without being based on any kind of historical figures the way many of her works are.
Great. And Erica, did you happen to find the other questions, or should I go ahead and fire
Well,
one?
I think Christy helped me find one. There's two. I know Julia Gale had asked about the Bohemian Girl, and then Brett Barney asks, what does Andy think is the weakest aspect of Cather's writing, or her weakest novel?
I think her weakest novel is Alexander's Bridge. It's not a terrible novel. It's her first book. Largely weak because she seems to lack the confidence. Well, it's very different, a lot of her work. It seems a little derivative of other works of that time, a lot like Henry James or Edith Wharton, things that were very trendy at the moment. But I also would say, though, there's a lot to respect about her poetry. That is, to me, weaker than some of the fiction. I have been convinced by my colleagues like Robert Thacker and Kari Rani, who are working on editing her poetry, that there's more there than I've appreciated in the past. So I have more to learn about it, but it is not my favorite. But thank you, Brett. Always appreciate a question from you. And Julia, you have one about Bohemian Girl?
Yeah, I think Julia, she was maybe just asking you to comment about Bohemian Girl.
Well, that is one of my favorite Cather short stories. And interesting, I just mentioned Alexander's Bridge, the novel she published, her first book in 1912. That was the same year she published a short story called The Bohemian Girl. And if you look at her life story, you can kind of see this was a choice she's going to make. It's the sort of Alexander's Bridge, Boston, London, conventional romantic triangle kind of thing. Bohemian Girl, Nebraska, a different kind of emotional situation, a long, beautiful section about a dance in a barn. You know, just like a different kind of setting. And they are both in the same year, and she clearly, the Bohemian Girl, won. It was the one that was more telling of what the later Cather fiction would be. And it's a beautiful story. And it was, the title comes from an opera, actually, by Balfe is the last name of the composer. He's Irish, I believe. And it is used, the music from the opera is referenced many times in the short story. But there's also an actual Bohemian Girl in the story.
Andy, I have somebody who took a shortcut and sent me a direct message question for you, and that would be Matt Steinhausen from rural Lancaster County. I don't know if you know Matt, excellent guy. But he wants to know a little bit about Edith Lewis's influence on Cather's life and Cather's writing.
Oh, thank you. That's great. And Edith Lewis is probably the most important relationship in Cather's life. She and Cather were domestic partners for nearly 40 years. My friend and colleague, Melissa Homestead, you'll be glad to know, will be publishing a book next year on Cather and Lewis's creative partnership. Not only were they a couple for many years, but Lewis was a professional editor and businesswoman, and there's a lot of evidence that she helped Cather create her work as her editor. They would read manuscript together. Manuscript exists with Lewis's hand all over it, and clearly she had a significant impact on polishing Cather's work. So Lewis is really important, and I have to give my great thanks to Melissa Homestead as well, because she, through just tremendous research, uncovered so much about Lewis that was lost. Lewis had been disregarded in a lot of ways by previous scholars, and Melissa has done amazing work in her book, and I look forward to it, as I hope you all do.
That's great. I think we have another question. We tried to promise ourselves we'd keep this to a half hour or so we wouldn't tire people out on the first go round. Hopefully we'll have Andy back, by the way. He said he's game for it. So if you guys want to continue Cather conversations, we'll do this again, and as much as people want. But Erica, do you have another question for Andy then?
I do, and I wrote this down in case it disappeared this time. But this question is from Ellen Lyric, and she says, did Cather identify with the protagonists in The Song of the Lark and or Lucy Gayheart?
I think for sure The Song of the Lark was a pretty autobiographical, at least emotionally and in some of the childhood experiences. There are characters in there who were very influential on the main character, main protagonist, that are based on some people Cather knew when she was young. And so for sure, I think that one, that Cather, her own experience of becoming an artist influenced that book. Lucy Gayheart, I don't know quite so much. What's interesting, her perspective as an older woman when she wrote that, I think was probably more centered on some of the other characters in that novel. And one thing I would say about Lucy Gayheart, if you read it, is you don't, the book doesn't really reveal what it is really concerned with until the end. I don't mean there's a big riddle or mystery in that way, but you realize where she's going is so important to what that book's about. And there's a very different kind of perspective that comes from her deep experience and I think wisdom.
Excellent. And Erica, I see we have another question that snuck in, and that is just fine if we want to go ahead.
Do we
and
have
take that.
time?
Sure, go ahead.
This one is from Edgar Hicks. He doesn't say where he's from, but I know he's in Omaha. It has been a while since I've read Cather, but Andy, do you recall her writing about corn in Nebraska? And do you know the quote from one of her books about grain production?
Yes, and I might not be able just to rattle it off, but I believe it's in O Pioneers when there is, well, there are a few different passages where corn growing is discussed. And there's one passage, I think it's O Pioneers, where she talks about the effect of the heat in Nebraska being perfect for the production of corn. And I believe also the discussion of the characters who have learned about new growing agricultural approaches through the university. And that was sort of based on some of the research and agricultural research that was happening at the university during her time there. And there's also references, I believe, in Maya Antonia as well to how the landscape, how the agricultural landscape there and the corn growing. But I think O Pioneers would be the place to really look for some of the best quotes about agricultural production.
That is great. Thanks, Andy. So just to be respectful of everybody's time, I guess I kind of as a final, some parting thoughts from you, I've got two kind of things I wanted to ask. And one is just, again, reflecting back to this idea of Cather representing Nebraska in the Statuary Hall. And if you have any kind of final comments on why you think that she is the perfect choice to represent Nebraska. And then also just kind of if there's anything you want to say about what you're working on these days, I'd really like to, I think people would love to hear what you're up to.
Yeah, well, in the Statuary Hall, I have to say, as a Nebraskan, I'm very proud to be represented by both Standing Bear and, when it's done, Willa Cather. I feel like both of them, they are people whose lives really they're advocated for the dignity of human experience and the preciousness of human life and the human experience. And I think it's great to have that there representing us. Cather is also one of the great ambassadors for Nebraska in her work, which has reached so many readers around the world. She has embedded Nebraska deep in the hearts of people, in their imaginations, and it's brought a lot of people here to see our landscape, to meet our people. And I think that's a wonderful thing, and I'm so glad that they're both going to be representing Nebraska to the nation and to those who visit DC. And as far as what I'm working on now, the letters work continues. The team and I are working together on that at least for a few more years until we finish, and sometimes it feels like it may go on until I die. And the other project I'm working on now is I'm writing a biography of Cather, and I have several years to go, but I'm hoping I can take a lot of the information I've learned from the research on the letters and put that together in the first really a new Cather biography in many, many years.
That will be exciting to see. I'd love to, can't wait for that to come out. I have a question that I wanted to share that I can't say no to this person asking a question. It's Molly O'Halloran from North Platte.
North Platte.
We adore Molly, and former Humanities board member. And she wants to know, would Willa Cather have any advice during the pandemic?
That's a good question. And one thing that I think Cather did during moments of crisis in her life was try to not only concentrate on the stress of the moment, but to get a big view and a deep view of the human experience and human history, and to realize how we are a part of a long story. And that is, I think, a consolation. That's why maybe reading Cather for many of us right now might be comforting, because we realize that the human experience is rich and deep and long, and where for me as a person and as a reader, that is a comforting thought, to realize that a lot of people have been through things before, they've survived, they've triumphed, they have been creative and made wonderful things in the moments of those crises, and the world has continued on. And I think Cather liked to think about those things as well.
That sounds like a perfect note to conclude this first version of Humanities at Home Live on. And Andy, Jewell, we really appreciate your time and just all you really do for both, the scholarship side of Willa Cather and everything else you do, your teaching and everything, but just your passion for sharing the stories with Nebraskans like today. And we just really appreciate that.
Well, thank you so much to you and to all that Humanities Nebraska does to make this state a better place.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to mention in closing too that Andy, like lots of others, wonderful scholars, are in the Humanities Nebraska Speakers Bureau. And so hopefully we'll be able to do something like this over the coming weeks with other speakers. And we definitely look forward to the day when our speakers, before too long, hopefully, are back out doing the programs in schools and libraries and museums and senior centers and so forth all over the state. They just do a lot of amazing work in connecting Nebraskans with our history and our culture and the humanities in general. Again, thanks. We really appreciate the partnership of the University of Nebraska and the Cather Archive, the work of the Cather Foundation. So please check all them out. Please follow Humanities Nebraska on social media like Facebook. We're also on Instagram and Twitter to keep up with our news. You can sign up for our email list too. We do a weekly e-blast that right now is called Humanities at Home, just sharing different ways to keep the humanities part of your life right now. And I just want to mention, we do have one more of these scheduled right now for next Friday, April 17th at 6 p.m. We're going to be doing a special program. It was originally going to be an in-person program for our patron circle donors, individuals who are supporting Humanities Nebraska with $1,000 or more annually. But we've converted it to a virtual program since we all can't be together. And we want to make it open to anybody. So it's going to be Diane Bystrom, and Diane has a wonderful program on women's suffrage in Nebraska. And so it'll be it should be an interesting program. It's going to be at 6 p.m. Next Friday. We'll be putting out more information about that. And again, just to thank you all for your support and what you do, and just hope you're all staying well, taking care of yourselves, and we look forward to seeing you all soon.